So today I'm going to talk about ASP.NET MVC. I want to talk about some exam strategies I've used and a few other bits and pieces I'll talk about in a little. I think you all know me now. I'm a software developer here, but now we'll be here for 2 years now. We've got an MCSD in Windows startups and most recently in web applications, which one of the exams was on MVC, so it seemed like an appropriate thing to talk about, whilst it's still all fresh in my mind. So we'll start talking with some of the basics. So what is MVC as a pattern? Why would we use it? And where does ASP.NET ASP.NET MVC come into it? We'll speak about some of the core constructs of MVC. Let's talk a little bit about responsive design. I missed one point on here, but there's a little bit on performance as well, and some useful tools. So yeah, like I said, let's start off with a bit of a tangent with exam strategies. Oops. The animation. Yeah, bad idea. So yeah, so I've attended 6 certification exams so far. So I've tried a few different ways of revising. So one of the ones I tried most recently was Pluralsight. Now I found it was really good for a practical understanding of the subject, and I'd still recommend Pluralsight, but they weren't really aligned with the exam very well. So if you were, say, dropped into a project or something and you didn't know much about technology, Pluralsight would be a good start, but for the exam itself, you probably wouldn't want to use that alone. Microsoft Word are just starting to look at doing an exam, then that's probably a good start really, because it gives you a high level understanding of before kind of getting in deeper. MSDN is pretty good. It can be quite, there's a lot of detail on there, in some cases too much, possibly for the exams. What I've done in the past is I've just Googled for the exam number, and people have written blog posts which will link to the MSDN articles, and so they'll link to all the information you need there really. It's good for a deep technical understanding. And finally, the Microsoft exam reference books. They align really closely with the exam, and I found them the most useful. The summaries at the end and the questions themselves are very similar in the kind of way they're written, so you feel a lot more comfortable in the exam itself with those books. So out of all of them, I'd recommend the reference books, but they're all useful tools anyway, regardless. So MVC, I like the one with Tom Simpson in this. So talk a little bit about MVC here. I'll put a diagram on the next one. So typically, the bottom right user, they would make some kind of request to the controller. Now the controller would manipulate the model in some way. Perhaps populating it by reading from a database or something, and then the view would the model would be updated with the properties of that view, and in the end, what the user sees would be a view. So it's an architectural pattern for implementing interface to display to a user. It separates the problem into 3 concise parts. So we've got the model, which is the behaviour of the problem domain. The view, obviously the visual representation of that model. And then we have the controller, which can send commands to the model and the view to update accordingly. So we'd use MVC because separation of concerns keeps things, logical aspects together, keeps things readable. So obviously in turn that helps with maintainability and also in the way we can test the things. MVC's been around quite a while as a concept. I think it was originally thought up in the 70s. And it could be used for desktop development. MVVM tends to be the thing we use now. and it's sometimes used in game development as well. So, ASP.NET is Microsoft's implementation. Sorry, ASP.NET MVC is Microsoft's implementation of MVC using ASP.NET. One of many ways to create websites, alternative to like web forms, it's all the type. And typically, a web request would come into the controller, and that is determined by a process called routing, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And essentially, the controller will prepare the model, well, it will update the model, so for example, populate it, like I said before, by reading from the database, for example, and it'll prepare the view. The view is then displayed and populated with the data from that model, and then it's, the view is rendered by the view engine, which we'll talk about in a moment. So, set of views. So typically views are constructed of HTML, CSS, and C#. We'll speak about less a little bit later, if we have time. And essentially, you write to this view file, and it's parsed by a view engine. So the older type, which doesn't tend to be used as much now, is the ASPX view engine. So you can see the typical syntax here would be if you want to write some C# inside of your ASPX file, you would start your codes using greater than and percentage symbol, and it ends in a, sorry if I say less than percent symbol and percentage greater than at the end. Like I say, this is the older one, it can sometimes be harder to read, so there's more syntax in there. Whereas Razor, which is the newer one, is a lot easier to read, it's more natural, you can almost just type it and it just kind of works. It's a lot nicer. And then there's third-party view engines available as well, they all have their own goals, but typically you would tend to either just use one of these two because they come out of the box. So, models, many better pictures than that one, I'll searching big images models.
How many of them work safe?
So models compose the properties that describe that model. One of the things we have on models are data annotations, and they can indicate to the view engine how to render the controls. But they can also be used for describing the validation for properties on that page. So, code. Let's quickly show you what a model looks like. I think I have to use that. Probably. No, that should be. That's what we've painted.
So the model will be.
Is that a 7? Oh, sorry.
Would the model be like an interface to something that you're writing, like a structure of it, with all the properties?
So
it's all the code that will assign those properties values and read values.
yeah, you could do it that way. Yeah. There's just some boilerplate code you get with the standard MVC template. If we scroll down a bit. In fact, I'll just quickly show you a view as well, just so you know what that looks like. So we go to the index. So this is using the Razor syntax. So you can see there's a load of HTML there. That's probably not the best example. So you can see some things here, like we're accessing a string here from the view bag. So we start off our codes out of the @ symbol, and that basically means we're writing C# at that point. Let's skip over to the model. So I have a model class here. So you can see this is the account view model. Well, it's the code, it's all in a single class C# file, but you can see the manage user view model here, where it looks like we're probably changing a password. So we've got an old password, a new password, and a confirmed password. And we can say on here that it's required, the old password, how what the data type is, its password, and how to display it in the UI. So the view engine can pick up all these things and assume certain things in the way it's rendered. Okay. We have a app controller. So it has actions that deal with returning a view or updating the model. So an action is basically a method, which is the name given on a controller. So a HTTP request reaches the controller through routing, which we will speak about soon. So a typical HTTP GET, if you open your browser, you navigate to a web page, what would happen is you'd reach an action on the controller based on the URL. That action populates the model, so like I say, might read from a database. The model is passed to the view engine to be rendered, and then the rendered output is sent to the client's browser as HTML. And then kind of in reverse, if you want to update a model, then you can make a post request to that controller, and say it would post the updated model, and you could save that to the database. And typically you would still return a new page at that point, possibly showing new data. Tell you what, I'll show all the code at the end because it's probably a bit faff just switching between. So I'll show a quick overview of the project. So routing, it's Route 66. So it's responsible for the mapping of an incoming HTTP request to a controller and its associated action or methods on that controller. So a typical route table looks like this. So when we're setting things up, we can specify to ignore certain paths. So if we wanted to say, tell MVC to ignore that path altogether, if you want to link to a file or something, then you could use ignore routes, and it would just be handled by ASP.NET. Or we can map a route specifically as well. So what's happening here is we're naming this as a default route. That part doesn't matter too much, just for readability. We have the URL as well. So we're saying, so you could be on your website.com/ and then you would specify each part. So you would specify the controller you're on. So it could be accounts / action, which could be like, I don't know, modify, and then an ID, maybe some ID associated with that account. And we also specify some defaults here as well, so you could miss out any of those parts, and it would be substituted with that instead. So we could miss out action and ID, and just specify the controller. So just your website.com / account, and it was it would put index in place and URL parameter optional in place, which is essentially an empty string anyway. I'll show you more of how it's set up in a bit. So this is on cross-cutting concerns. This is a guy cutting crossly. So these are things which can affect several possibly unrelated areas of the system, but you don't want to scatter your code throughout. So one example, well, some of the examples of these are logging. If you want to log when something hits that, all the methods in your controller, normally if you were say, well, if we're say tracing, if we had like a trace.write line, so instead of putting that at the start and the end of your methods and scattering it all throughout, you could just apply your own custom attribute on that controller, and then all the methods in there could run whatever code you wanted. I've got a little code snippet for that as well. So here we've got an action filter attribute. Obviously you can't instantiate it, it's abstract, but if you were to inherit from that, you have the ability to override these things. So top, there's many here really, but we'll start with the second one, on action executing. So you could override that before your action is actually executed. So if you maybe had your own, something you wanted to run before it's actually executed, maybe you wanted to stop it from running altogether, then you could override that. On action executed is when the action is successfully executed. And the same, we've got on result executed, on result executing. At the end of your action, you would typically return a view, and so it's basically part of the code that runs before you return that view runs after. And they're called this whole attribute system is called action filters. So they can be applied at the method level, or the controller level, which would apply them to all methods, or even globally throughout the application. Some typical ones are the authorize attribute. You need to be logged in to hit these actions, and there's some on caching, handling errors, and like I say, you can create your own as well by implementing, inheriting that action filter attribute. So a little bit on performance. So one thing we can do is do something called bundling, which is essentially if you have loads and loads of let's say CSS files and JavaScript files, we can, through bundling, we can package those up into a single file, which would mean you would just have to download that file once. Now you'd want to do that because browsers, or modern browsers, tend to have a maximum of 6 simultaneous connections at once. So you can imagine if you have 50 files, then that's going to slow things down quite a lot. Because one of the most expensive parts anyway, it would be opening the connection rather than the actual download itself. And they're not necessarily a single file for the whole application. You can group them together into related things. Minifications are the one, so that's just removing unnecessary white space, break lines. It also does things with JavaScript so that you can you have your nice, friendly, long variable names, and it'll reduce those to say a single character, because at the end of the day, the browser doesn't care how that's returns to it. It knows how to deal with it. We only name variables nice things because it's easy to program with. So it cuts all that down and it reduces the size of the file. And some miscellaneous things not necessarily related to MVC, but if you have lots of little, say, glyphs in your application or images, obviously that's going to have an impact as well because of simultaneous connections issues. So you could, there's a tool I'll talk about a little bit later called Web Essentials. It's a Visual Studio extension, and we can basically take an image and embed that into the CSS file itself. So it probably won't be a great idea if you've got huge images, but if you've got a tiny little icon, it'll save that overall another connection being made again. And then just got like common ones really, avoiding inline styles, inline JavaScript. You don't want them embedded in the HTML for various reasons, but one of them is performance. So I'm going to talk a bit about responsive design now, just briefly. I mean, a lot of the stuff today I'm talking about, it doesn't cover everything MVC can do, and the stuff you'll see if you want to take the exam. But it's kind of a higher level understanding so that you can get a more general knowledge of what it's all about. So, responsive design is essentially developing your application so that it's supported across a range of screen sizes. Obviously, we have loads of different kinds of devices now. from my firm to tablets, desktop PCs, TVs. Yeah, so there's a whole range of sizes. A popular way of doing it is mobile first. So you start by designing your smallest device first and just build your way up. Another good reason, even if you're designing for a desktop as well, is like Windows 8, you could have in Explorer and full view, or you can have it snapped. So there's still cases you might want to consider responsive design, even if you're working on the desktop. One way you do that is by using percentages. If instead of using pixels everywhere to define the size of the objects on the view, if you're using percentages, then it's going to expand with the resolution of the screen. So it'll always kind of look the same. However, you probably wouldn't want to do that. You probably wouldn't want your desktop view to look the same as it would on a mobile. So that's kind of where media queries come in. CSS media queries basically let you group up sets of styles based on the screen orientation or width, height, that kind of stuff. And so what you could do is use a combination of media queries and percentages, which would, so that you still have a bit of flexibility with the percentages to when the screen resizes, but if you're stepping up to say between a desktop and a firm, you might want to switch out different views, you might want to hide navigation or change it to a different user control altogether. Popular mobile first frameworks, Bootstrap, I'm sure most of you have heard of that. It's pretty good out of the box for developers especially, because you can get things looking pretty with not much effort. If you stick to using the Bootstrap constructs as well, you could easily switch your version of Bootstrap out for the customized version. There's a few of those available. I'll show you some of those now, because there's a couple of cool ones. So, well, I'll show you what Bootstrap looks out of the box with ASP.NET MVC. So that's the default layout. It's pretty basic, but obviously it's got a nice blue button there. We have the big jumbotron at the top, which is nice and clean. You could also switch out to something else if you wanted. People customise them online, so there's tons available. Here's a good one. You can switch out CSS first if you want the site to look like this, and then it's easy enough to do. So it's
Curses the revenge.
yeah, it's like supports all sorts like links, buttons, just everything that comes out of Bootstrap really. A little drop down there and stuff, so it's pretty cool.
If anyone suggests this does not have a website, you've been shot. We get those
Give you that retro Poland feel.
I've got another retro one here for 90s kids.
Oh my god, it's Revenge of GeoCities.
So, we've got everything there you could ever want.
So what you're saying is if we take a Bootstrap project, we could just pull this in with
Pretty much, yeah. If you stick to like if you use the correct Bootstrap classes and things throughout, then
wow, Morris is getting a facelift.
Doesn't have anywhere in your
and then there are some more sensible things like this one. It's just like a Metro one. So yeah, there's all the buttons and labels, warning messages and whatnot. So yeah, Bootstrap's pretty handy for getting the site built up. And it's responsive as well. That's the other thing I should probably show you. It's responsive out of the box. So if I show you,
Can we show that on the old?
yeah, why not? This one.
Yeah.
I've not tested it. Hopefully they've implemented it properly. So yeah, you can see. Probably I go to the very top.
The media queries are already built into Bootstrap.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you can see there, this is in desktop mode. If you concentrate mainly on that top navigation bar at the top, so we're obviously in desktop mode at the minute, and things start to collapse and change around. So they've collapsed a bit. I think the menu's gone into this drop down now, is it? I'll show you on this because it's clearer. So you see there where we've got register and login, you keep getting smaller, and this is probably a mobile view now. So those things have been collapsed because they don't fit as well on the screen, but it's under a navigation menu there instead, that drops down. And whereas before we had columns, they've turned into rows now. If I expand that back out again, you can see there columns there. So getting started to get more libraries. So dropped underneath each other there. So, yeah. So, quick on some useful tools. So Visual Studio 2013, a web browser link now. Behind the scenes, there's a Signal R connection that goes on, and so if you are making changes in either the browser itself or in Visual Studio, editing CSS, HTML and stuff, all you have to do is save. You don't have to redeploy out and whatnot. You just save, and it just updates the web page straight away. And the good thing about that as well is you could have loads of browsers open. You could have, if you have a few monitors anyway, you could have like Chrome, Firefox. You could have the Windows Phone emulator up, and just update those all on the fly, see what it looks like right there and then. Web Essentials is the Visual Studio extension. There's tons of stuff in there. You can do a whole private training on it, really. But that helps with lots of little things, really. Yeah, I'll let you look into that. So, JS Fiddle's pretty handy for that when you're learning new things. When we start on Monitor, we use JS Fiddle a bit just for testing things out with knockout and stuff. It's just handy to have. I should probably explain what it is. Basically, it's a website you navigate to, and you have 4 windows. You have a HTML window, a CSS window, a JavaScript window, and an output window. And you can just write codes in the browser and easily pull in JavaScript libraries, so like Knockout, and it's a nice way of just testing things out without having to redeploy out, especially with SharePoint, because if you want to deploy things out, it can be time consuming. Okay, what time are we on?
Half past.
Okay. So let's speak about less CSS a little bit. So it's a CSS preprocessor. You write something called less, and CSS that can be rendered by the browser and comes out. It basically lets you write CSS in a more programming kind of way. So you've got variables. So if you had a color palette, you could set your colors, and then you would just reference them everywhere else. There's things called mixins, which is a bit like a method with an optional parameter. I'll show you some of this at the end when I go through the codes. Nesting, so you can nest just as you would in codes, like you've got your curly braces for your scope, so you can do nesting slightly differently. And operations, so you can do things like add colours together as well. I'll show you that in a moment.
Can I just add something?
Sure.
One of the things me and James have been looking at is, because there's another one called SAS,
Oh yeah.
which is the same kind of thing. We've been looking at what's the easier one. Less is very much program friendly, but SAS is probably more design friendly.
Okay.
There is a discussion we're having at the moment of which is actually the better one to use.
Okay.
We've also got an individual studio.
I suppose for probably a black marble then for designers, it sounds like SaaS is
Yeah.
probably a better option. Maybe if you're developing your own site by yourself, then maybe less. So a quick summary, and then I'll just quickly show you some codes. So today we spoke about MVC and why we'd use it with ASP.NET. Some of the basic MVC constructs in ASP.NET. Model views, controls, routing, cross-screen concerns, and responsive design and performance. So I'll show you some code in a minute, but does anyone have any questions? Anything I weren't too clear about? So let's get this ready. Since we're just speaking about less, I'll quickly go over that. So I've got the Web Essentials installed on this. So one of the other things it does is, if you don't know your hexadecimal colours too well, then it gives you like a little indication there at the top. So there's variables, and as you can see, they're used throughout. So here we've got background colour, what references it. We've got a mix in here, which essentially takes, you can set a load of CSS properties within that block, and then you can just apply them wherever you want. So within the Jumbotron here, I've basically said just dashed border 5 pixels. Up here you can see there's a default of 10 pixels, but if you specify 5 pixels there, then that would override that.
So is that a bit like inheritance or composition for CSS then?
I guess so. Operations, I don't know why that's there, but yeah, so there we've got some colours being added together. Yeah, and you can see on the window on the right hand side, this is added with Web Essentials as well. You can see the actual CSS output and what it produces for you. So it just happens in this case you've probably written more to write less, but you can imagine if you're writing quite a lot of CSS, then eventually the output of the CSS may be more, but the less would be clearer to read, and it should be easier to write.
And if you wanted to make a change, you can make the change in one place probably rather than having to make it in a zillion places.
Yeah. So if I'll launch this now. Let's see what my beautiful website looks like. There we go. Lovely. But one of the other things, like I said, was browser links. Say, oh, I don't want this style sheet at all now. Let's comment that out and save it. And just without even recompile or anything, it just reflects the updates straight away.
You can do it the other way as well, can't you? Get push back into there.
Yeah.
I believe so. I've not actually tried it. Let's see. I'm not that familiar with the developer tools on new style. Let's go here. And, yeah. Not sure if it's something you need to trigger at that point. Maybe we need a refresh in here still.
I think after the F12 hours, I think.
12 out.
No, on the Web Essentials bar.
Oh, what auto sync?
Yeah, I think it's that one you link it back.
Yeah, I did see the builds you could do it, so I haven't actually tried it myself.
So I can't remember if it's that one or it's.
I did try in Chrome and it didn't work, and I assumed it was just something to do with Chrome, but I don't know. You definitely can do it. I've probably just not got something set up.
Or a change this tab and then so
Right. Yeah, you can definitely do it. It's, yeah. What else did I want to show you? So I've showed you less. I've showed you browser link. I've showed you a model. I'll show you a controller quickly. So if I, so when I was talking about the defaults earlier with the routing, so if I go to the root site at the minute, which is just a local host on that port, it'll take me to the home controller with the index action, and it returns the index view. So essentially, if I were to write index, get the same thing. Go to start. We've got root config. So yeah, that's just what I showed you before. Going back to our action filters. So, like I say, if you want to apply them, you can apply them to an action themselves, or you can apply them at the controller level. So here you can see there's the authorize on the account controller, so that applies it to everything in that controller, every action. But then there's some which are specific as well. There's like a validate anti-forgery token here, which has just been applied to that specifically. And we've got like an allow anonymous here, so everything in that controller you need to be authorized to do unless allow anonymous is specified. So in this case it's a login method because obviously you need, you can't, if you need to be authenticated to log in, then it's kind of pointless, isn't it? But if you want to say apply authorization throughout your application, you can do it in filter config. And essentially, even if you have any custom attributes or whatever, you can just add them into this global filters collection and pass in as many as you want into there, and that's applied globally. What else have we got in here? I'll show you the bundle, how the bundling works. So well, if I go to views, we have a shared here, and then we have layout, which is basically like a master page, which is used throughout the views, unless you specify a specific one for that controller. So this is like a generic one used throughout. And one of the things you'll see at the top here is styles.render. There's also scripts.render, but this string here is basically saying, is basically, well, it's the name of that bundle. So if we go to the bundle config again, we can see here, that's the name, and we want to include all these files. I can have wildcards and things in between as well. You can see a bit further down for the CSS, so we're including Bootstrap, the home CSS, site CSS. Yeah. And essentially that tilde there is saying the root and then content.
Does that really only affect the first time you hit the page with a browser? Because surely browser caching means that actually once you've got the CSS files on the browser once, you're not going to get that much benefit from bundling.
Yeah, as long as it is caching them, I guess, but the initial connection, if you've got a lot, then it will it'll slow things down certainly the first time. It depends what's been cached exactly, I guess.
You have to make cell caching turned on as well.
Yeah.
Not long by default, MVC project.
No, the browser will, regardless of the server-side caching, the browser will cache the static CSS and JS files locally for you. So once you put them down once, it doesn't forget them.
If there's no cache policy set on the server, no, it won't come down any time.
Well, I think that's everything I wanted to talk about. I'm sure there's something I've forgotten along the way, but that's it from me.